Hello again from the upper level library of the American College of Greece. I am Eugenia Zoumaka, and together we will move on to our next subject. Sponsorship is more than football and banners. Let's welcome Mr. Matthew Leopold, Director of European Sponsorship Association.
Well, Apogevma, I think, or hope, is the correct greeting. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the world of sponsorship and shatter some of the assumptions and illusions that you might have about this fabulous discipline. Football is very often seen as one of the grand pinnacles of sponsorship, but I think I want to try and open your eyes to some of the limitations that we've seen and some of the opportunities that sponsorship offers, and allow you to really question and ask, is sponsorship really making a difference? Is it cutting through? My name is Matthew Leopold, and I am a non-executive director at the European Sponsorship Association. The ESSA is a membership body that represents sponsorship all across Europe. We have members from brands and agencies, right holders and suppliers from right the way across continental Europe. We represent their issues, and then we help to raise the profile of good sponsorship. I'm also a sponsorship practitioner. I'm currently the head of brand and communications at LexisNexis, a global legal intelligence supplier. And I was previously the brand director and head of sponsorship for big US tech giant RingCentral, and then the domestic energy supplier, British Gas. So sponsorship can be amazingly powerful. It can drive emotion. It can drive a change in thought and opinion and feeling from our customers. It can make a social impact, and it can really make people care. So sponsorship can make people more positive and much stronger feelings about your brand. However, if it's not done well and it's not done properly, it can be an enormous waste of time and money. Good sponsorship needs some really careful thought and consideration to make it work. All too often, the bigger the budgets that we see, the bigger the audience, the less thought goes into how do we make a sponsorship efficient and effective. And sadly, over the last 20 years or so, the world of sponsorship really hasn't changed or evolved. The same old basic model of sponsorship is used. Generally, you put a logo on someone's shirt, or put a logo on the perimeter board around the sports venue, and then you try and get some form of association with the club or with the sport. And this is such old-fashioned thinking. And there's a lot of this old-fashioned thinking that crops up, particularly in the world of football. Now, obviously, there are examples, and there are great examples of great sponsorship in football. But all too commonly, football is a very simple model of sponsorship. And the world of marketing, as I'm sure you're aware, and as we've just been hearing on the last few sessions, marketing has evolved, yet sponsorship has not. So we need to ask ourselves, does sponsorship really think about the business problem that it's trying to fix? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Then sponsorship always seems to look at media as being the primary measure of success. So we seem to measure sponsorship in terms of column inches, in terms of likes and shares. So we look at the wrong measures of success through visibility and noise. Do we ever ask ourselves in the world of sponsorship, who is the customer? Who is it that we're actually trying to speak to and speak with? And what do we want them to do? Or do we just go, oh yes, I want to talk to the fans of this club or the fans of this sport? But as you well know, you're not the same as the person who sits next to you. You're not the same as the person who participates on a pitch alongside you. We all have different motivations. We all have different insights. And again, that's the next thing. Sponsorship so often doesn't understand or doesn't look at the different insights, the different drivers, the different measures that make people act and behave. And finally, the biggest thing that sponsorship needs to think about is not just how sponsorship works, because I think we have a rough idea how it works. We really need to think about why it works. And if we can understand why it works, then we can do much more, better, good, cut-through sponsorship. So we are stuck in this old world of thinking about sponsorship. And this is the model that I ask you to question and stop. So we need to stop thinking about an audience, seeing a brand, being aware of that brand, and then hoping for the best. Because if that's the pure level of your sponsorship, we're only ever going to get really basic ideas of image transfer, which I'll challenge in a minute. We'll get levels of brand awareness and we'll get levels of brand recall. Is this sufficient when people are spending hundreds of millions of pounds on sponsorship? Is it sufficient to get a bit of image transfer, a bit of awareness, and a bit of recall? And I genuinely believe it is not. And I know we can do better. And this is my call to action to you to help make the world better by doing this. The world of sponsorship, as I mentioned, is very, very old world, right? And it generally leans heavily on this old-fashioned model. It looks at eyeballs and visibility. So brands spend a lot of money buying branding for that audience. Then this drives awareness of that brand's involvement in sponsorship, which, as I've just explained, drives image awareness and recall. But let's just pick out and question, are these things success? Is image transfer good? Is brand awareness working? Is brand recall really what we want? So I'm just going to I picked a random football club. I change it every time I give this presentation just so I can have fun with all of them. So we're going to pick on Liverpool Football Club. Okay? You want to sponsor Liverpool Football Club. Excellent. Why are you sponsoring them? How are we going to cut through? How are we going to draw differentiation between Liverpool Football Club and other football clubs? Why put your brand and your sponsorship with that particular club? What is there that differentiates Liverpool from others? Is it success? Well, sure, they're a very successful club, but how can you show success compared to all the other teams that are in the match? Only one wins generally in the big matches, so how do you differentiate from those other teams? And is that enough to really make a difference in the world of sponsorship? I argue not. Let's talk about image transfer. So what is it that transfers? Their values? Well, we hear this a lot. Oh, it's transferred values. And I ask you to really think about this. Those four I put up on the screen here are the values that Liverpool sets out to have. Dignity, ambition, unity, and commitment. Really powerful statements. But if I didn't tell you that was Liverpool Football Club, would you know which football club that was? And indeed, do those four values align to almost every company you can ever imagine? Because every company wants to show dignity. They want to show ambition. They want to show unity. They want to show commitment. So what brand values, what image transfer are we actually getting? And yes, okay, there is some. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But is it going to impact and progress your brand in the way that you might hope? Then in terms of brand awareness. So here is just a screenshot of all of Liverpool's current sponsors. Right? We've got some fabulous brands here. We've got some that, quite honestly, I've never heard of. The football sponsorship market is very cluttered. So how do brands stand out? How do they differentiate from each other? How do customers care? Do you think that fans of Liverpool Football Club recognize and know all of these sponsors in this list? And the truth is, I'm afraid they don't. So we need to think really cleverly if we're going to be a sponsor of football. We need to think about how do we make sure our brand cuts through in a way that the others don't. We need to think about ways that we can grab fans and tell our stories. So how many of these brands here have you seen of, that you know of, and that you know are sponsoring the football club? And I suspect it's not going to be many. Now, brand recall is a particularly interesting topic. What I'm showing you here on the screen is a survey that I ran when I worked for British Gas. And I asked a huge audience of people, which one of the following brands are sponsors of London 2012 Olympics? Now, you can see on the list here a number of really big British brands. Only 2 brands in that list were not Olympic sponsors. One was Tesco, which you can see appears at the bottom of the list, and one was British Gas. British Gas was not an Olympic sponsor, yet we were seen to be an Olympic sponsor more than Cadbury's, BP, Sainsbury's, and BMW. So what that tells us is that the awareness, the visibility of seeing brands around the venue, on television, sponsoring an event, doesn't necessarily drive impact. It doesn't necessarily change people's minds or educate them in a different way. It just drives visual memory. British Gas were sponsors for British swimming, a big Olympic sport. We spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money sponsoring the sport during Olympics 2012. But what did people remember? They thought that we were sponsors of the games, not that we had taken a cheaper option and sponsored a sport. So really important point, brand recall. Don't assume that people are going to recall the things that you think that they will. Now we need to ask ourselves, are we sponsoring, are we partnering for the right reason? And all too often, we don't necessarily sponsor for the right reason. Sometimes it's done because we think we might be a good fit. We think it might be interesting. We think it might be fun. Our bosses, the CEO, wants us to do it. And that's all very well. But do we actually think about what is the problem we're trying to fix and what does the audience want? So I think my first big call out to you is ask yourself, what is the business problem that you're trying to fix? And then once you've defined the business problem, ask yourself, is sponsorship the correct answer to this problem? And I'm going to give you one example at the end of the presentation where I will talk about an organization that I think has done a really good job in football sponsorship. But there are a number of really standout case studies. And the reason these all stand out is they all start with a really clear business problem, which they then translate into a marketing problem, which they then ask themselves, how is sponsorship able to fix this? And because it's a really strong answer, they perform really well. And all of this starts with what you want to achieve. What do you want to go out? What do you want to get from sponsorship? And this is where we need to think about the difference between an output and an outcome. And I hope that translates well enough into your language. And incidentally, I am always impressed that you run these events in English. I speak 2 words of Greek, and I am very, very impressed by anyone who can listen to a conference like this in English. So an output is looking at those metrics that are easy to measure. Things like clicks, or how many likes have you got on Facebook, or how many views of videos, how many column inches, how much AVE, equivalent advertising value, have you got through your PR? Right? Those are all outputs. Outcomes are you changing the way people think? Are you getting people to be more likely to buy? And if we only ever focus on outputs, then we will measure success by how many people have turned up in an event. And that's not a particularly impactful or helpful measure. Whereas an outcome, if we can look at how people have changed their opinion, how they're now more likely to buy our products or services, that is helpful. The challenge, of course, is measuring an outcome is much more difficult. So my challenge to you is to think about what outputs are you measuring and which ones are you defining as success? Because you may be looking at the wrong part of the equation and you might be driving more people to click like rather than more people to change their mind. And that's what sponsorship can allow us to do. So I think what we want to do now is we want to ask ourselves, how does sponsorship actually work? This is quite a text-heavy slide, so I apologize, but I'm going to read it very slowly. So sponsorship can help us to increase and maintain sales. How does it do this? It does this by increasing the chance, increasing the likelihood that customers will choose your brand over someone else's brand. How does it do that? It does that by making my brand more relevant than my competitor's brand to my customer. Okay, that's interesting. Making my brand more relevant than my competitor's brand. We do this by creating positive feelings, by building positive associations with the things that our customers care about or are interested in. So if I want to talk to fans of Liverpool Football Club, by me sponsoring Liverpool Football Club, by me investing money in Liverpool Football Club, I am creating positive feelings and positive associations between something that they care about because I also care about it. And that becomes a really strong foundation from which to build a sponsorship partnership. And this is the creation of positive feelings and positive associations. And it's about driving activations that people find interesting or entertaining or rewarding. So can people see that I'm making a difference to something that they care about? And this is what sponsorship can deliver. This is my theory, by the way, based on learnings from some quite outstanding marketing theorists, Byron Sharp and Millward Brown, for example. And I believe that good sponsorship can and should be driving measures such as likability and affinity. Right? Customers feel an affinity for a brand when they believe that it meets their needs, and that drives likability. It's about differentiation. So this brand feels different to other brands in the category, or it's setting a trend, it's setting a different speed into the market, and it differentiates because it feels different. It likes something that I, as a customer, also like. And then saliency is about being front of mind. So we want to make sure that my brand comes to the customer's mind quickly and easily when they were at the point of buying. Because we know just by putting my advertising on a football shirt, for example, someone does not necessarily want to go and buy my product today. What I want to do is make sure when they're in the market for buying my product, I'm the first brand that comes to mind. And then I'm much more likely to be able to get them to buy more, pay more for the products they're buying, and then gain market share. So what that means is that good sponsorship needs to catch the attention of the audience. Right? We need to stand out. We need to grab their attention and then build an emotional connection. Secondly, we need to create memory structures, or we create new or refresh existing memory structures so that people think about my brand and they can then recall my brand at the moment of choice. Right? So it's quite simple, but you can see already this is a lot more deep thinking than put a logo on a shirt, hope people associate the logo with me and with the team, and that will then change some brand scores. This is a lot more clever thinking about how we can catch attention, really think about reinforcing the memory structures so people think of my brand so that I can recall them at the moment of choice. And here is the model, the model that I advocate. So you'll notice the big change here is we're going to start to talk about fans. We're talking about the audience. They are the people that love the team, they love the sport, they love the activity. So we can use sponsorship to grab their attention. So you just think, your football team, you can spot someone walking down a street wearing your football team shirt from miles away. Why? Because your brain is tuned in. It's relevant to you. It's interesting to you. You'll pick it up and you'll spot it. The same when you skim a newspaper. Your eyes will spot the thing that talks about your club. Or if someone in the other side of the room mentions your name or mentions your football club in a busy party, your brain will hear it because it's so important to you. You're aware of it and it'll get your attention. So then we need to build a meaningful association. If there is no memory structure, if there's no association between the fan and the sponsoring brand, then the relationship ends and we'll just get those basic measures we were talking about before. We need to build a meaningful association that fans can understand. And this is what's absolutely gold. So it's about putting that fanship and engagement at the heart of the relationship. And how do we get these associations? Well, it's about having relevance. It's about having a connection. That is what cuts through. We know people pay attention to the things that they're interested in, and that is what brands need to play on. So let me give you an example. How do we achieve a meaningful association? There are two types. There's a rational association. So the example on the screen, the rational association between Castrol, the engine oil company, and motor racing. That is a rational connection. If you are a fan of motorsport, you will understand the importance of engine oil, and you will then see that association. It will make sense. Even if you're not a fan of motorsport, it makes sense. On the other side of the screen, we have Roger Federer. Right? Now, instinctively, the link here is less clear. And that's because this is an emotional connection. But with a little bit of prompting, there is an understandable connection around aspiration. Roger Federer is a global superstar, and he presumably wants to get the best in life. So Mercedes fits that bill. So essentially, if a customer is a tennis or a Federer fan, to be able to say, if it's good enough for Roger, it's good enough for me, is a really powerful emotional connection. So people pay attention to the things they like. If you like tennis, if you like Roger Federer, then actually you may be more aware of the wider scope of the things that Roger is involved in. If it's rational, we're seeing things that are just instinctively make sense. So that's the sort of the brief summary I wanted to take you through about actually how we can make sure football sponsorship adds even more value in the way that it's done. And I'm going to just take an example from Arsenal and talk about their sponsorship with Visit Rwanda. This was one of the first sleeve sponsorships that came out in football. Sleeve sponsorship is obviously it's not a particularly innovative solution, but what Visit Rwanda were able to do is they asked themselves a really clear business problem. And that problem was make people more aware of Rwanda as a holiday destination. And I think they did a phenomenal job doing this. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples as to what they did and why it made a difference. So, firstly, the country was made personal to fans through activation. So that was through activation both in the Arsenal Stadium on match day, made personal through road shows, through the events that they did, and of course locally in Rwanda. And we can see that they had local warriors came and did tribal dances. They decorated their venues, and there were banners and posters. They set up Rwanda Supporters Club and all sorts of activities, really bringing to life this activation. Really importantly, Arsenal also invested in football development in Rwanda. So they ran football coaching clinics, they sent players out, and they really supported and nurtured that football journey. So again, what they've done is they're capturing people's attention, they're creating a meaningful link, a really deep, meaningful link that has brought it to life using their players, using their assets to tell the story. And then, of course, critically, they then got their players and encouraged their players to go to Rwanda on holiday. So huge amounts of social media, people posting images of them, visiting the beautiful sites to see in Rwanda, meeting local people, playing football matches with local kids. A really, really successful campaign. And you can see here an example. I'm going to recommend all my friends holiday in Rwanda. That is a really powerful statement to come from a player. And of course, it was a really successful campaign too. So it saw an 8% increase in tourism. It saw a 4% increase in UK tourists. Before the partnership, 29% of Arsenal fans had considered going to Rwanda for a holiday. 1 year on from that partnership, 51% of people would consider going to Rwanda on holiday. So you can see here my trusting model. You've grabbed their attention. It's something different. It's something unusual. It's in plain sight. It's really clear to see. They built meaningful association. It wasn't just a badging exercise. It wasn't just a logo on a shirt. It was a genuine, meaningful, deep connection between the player, between the countries, between the organization and the fans. And they built a depth of engagement. They made sure that everyone could feel engaged and involved, and they brought it to life. And it made a really, really big difference and impact on their country's GDP, which is absolutely fascinating to see. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of my short presentation here. I believe we're now going to have the opportunity to have a little chat, potentially.
Of course, thank you, Mr. Leopold. We have questions, and we will start the Q&A session. For all of you who are watching us from home, please don't forget to use our official hashtag, and of course, write your questions. I would start with a couple of questions for you. So the audience is wondering, what is the main reason for the lack of development in the world of sponsorship?
I think that's a very interesting question. I believe that sadly, where sponsorship is involved, there is a lot of money, and often that money is spent based on assumptions and based on what has always been done in the past. And it's very difficult when you're trying to change a model to say, let's do something different. There's a huge amount of cash, and we keep doing what we've always done. And my challenge to the industry is to say, think about what we're trying to achieve, because we can do more with the money and we can make more impact. I also believe it's because sponsorship is fundamentally based on a number of incorrect assumptions. And I touched on a couple of them in my presentation. So one of those assumptions is the idea that values, the brand values that we put our sponsorship on, get transferred across. And as I hopefully demonstrated in that Liverpool Football Club example, they really do not get transferred across. What are the values that you're expecting to move over? How many customers, if you were to stop them on the street to say, what values do you associate with this brand, with this football club, would actually come up with anything? Because humans don't assign human characteristics to a brand or to a club. We just don't do it. Yet in a marketing boardroom, we tend to do so. So I think there are a number of assumptions that are used in the world of sponsorship that no one ever really challenges. We never really ask ourselves, why do we say this? And I think that's why there has been so little evolution, because we keep doing what we've always done.
Thank you very much. You have presented a successful example of Rwanda, but we have another question, whether you have a benchmark, an example of a football sponsorship that you consider as innovative and successful.
You know, I do, and I can give you a couple of examples. One example would be Marriott Bonvoy and Manchester United. And I think this is particularly interesting because the sponsorship wasn't a hotel chain, it was the hotel loyalty program. Now that's really interesting. Why would a loyalty program sponsor a massive football club? Well, of course, Marriott own 30 different hotel brands. So if they were only to have one hotel brand sponsor a very expensive sponsorship, then they're losing out on the opportunity for their whole network. By using the loyalty program, they were investing in the gel that joined together all of the different brands. Then, of course, they make the sponsorship all about trying to bring hospitality to life. So they were able to get value in kind placement. They were able to talk about their investment in sports. They were able to open up hotels next to the football ground. They had the players attending their hotels and using their hotels. They were able to talk about children and families. They were able to talk about entertainment. And they created a really rich structure which was different. It attracted attention. It had a meaningful association that people could understand why they were doing it and how they were joining it together. But really importantly, they had a business problem they were trying to fix. And that business problem was, how do we bring a brand new loyalty program to market globally and make people care about it? And I think they did a really clever job, and certainly a really impressive job of looking at assets around the world in order to bring this football sponsorship to life.
In fact, this is an excellent example. We have some context-specific question. One of those is, recently, more and more sponsorship have been suspended due to political issues or, in some cases, scandals. Why are brands reactive instead of proactive in such cases?
Well, this I think, again, the bigger the brand, the harder that they're likely to fall, but also the more complicated and the more structured the hierarchy is. So making big political statements, so don't forget, withdrawing from a sponsorship is a huge political statement in many cases. And in order to do that, it requires a lot of communication consultancy. It requires a lot of thought about, can we do this? Should we do it? What is the fallout and the risk of doing so? So often, it's almost easier to do nothing. And that's why I think we find that generally the brands are quite slow, because it's as much risk pulling out as it is staying in. And it's often easier to just be a bit slow and let the situation develop and see what happens. I think we are increasingly seeing things happen a bit faster. And I think brands are becoming a lot stronger at preparing for this as an eventuality. So creating the playbook, the guidance on what should we do if this happens. And certainly in my British Gas days, we created a number of different press releases. We did a bit of wargaming to plan what happens if there was a disaster, what do we need to do, how would we approach the media, how would we approach our customers, how would we approach the fans of the sport, so that we had stress tested a few different examples. Because I think withdrawing immediately from a sponsorship can have enormous repercussions, and it does need careful consideration and thought to ensure that every step has been well considered and well thought of. And I think what we're seeing now is that brands are a bit cannier to the fact that this might be an eventuality. They might do this. So they are being much better prepared for this as an outcome.
Maintaining the subject the same, what is your opinion on the latest decisions in sponsorship regarding issues like the war in Ukraine, for example, Gazprom deal was a 70-80 million deal. What's your opinion on this?
So I think I'm going to be very difficult and somewhat avoid your question. And I would say I think it's very important that at all times brands follow the laws of their country. And I think it is very easy to inadvertently make the incorrect political statement by the actions that you do or you don't take. And I think what we're seeing are a huge number of Western brands standing in solidarity with Ukraine and ensuring that they are being seen to withdraw from relationships that may not have the same pull and the same power as they used to. So I think brands are very, very, very able to make these political statements, but there are issues that surround it, and they do need to carefully think through the implications of doing and the implications of not doing. So, from a personal point of view, I think it's been quite heartening seeing big corporate giants act with such speed to make very, very difficult decisions, and I commend them for it.
Thank you so much. In fact, difficult circumstances and brands and sports need to survive and adapt on those. Going to the quite frequent question, yet very important one, how has sponsorship changed or evolved in the post-pandemic era?
So I think we might have seen sponsorship go back a little bit and revert back to some of its roots. Before the pandemic, I think we were seeing some increased measurement and evaluation developments, people were, to the point I made in my presentation, we were starting to see brands look a bit more cleverly at the outcomes they were trying to achieve. And I think following some of the financial crises, we were seeing that brands were being very careful with their expenditure and were demanding sponsorship professionals to demonstrate the impact that they were having. So I certainly in the UK and certainly over a lot of Europe, I think we started to see brands understand this and start to measure and invest in partnership deals that really were moving the dial for their commercial value. And I think during the pandemic, what we saw was quite a lot of, and you can't blame people for it, quite a lot of protectionism and understanding going, I need to make sure that my sponsorship budget is maintained. I need to maintain my headcount. And as such, what we saw was a little bit less bravery and a little bit more caution. And that meant that we went backwards a little bit in terms of some of the progressive thinking about how we can really use sponsorship to drive a brand forward commercially. On the other side of this, we have also seen brands invest much more heavily in digital activation. So we have seen a lot more sponsorship in live events such as this. Just for example, seeing Qatar, my favorite airline, by the way, even better now you get Avios points, so definitely sign up. And I'm not paid for that, but Qatar, you can pay me. Great example as to how we can bring a sponsorship to life through a hybrid event. So I think we've seen some really clever channel evolution over the last 2 years.
So one more question. The latest numbers from the European Sponsorship Association show that the industry is rising up. The 2021 season was very close to the 2019 one, best year since 2017. So do we expect that 2022 will be even better?
So I very, very much hope so. And certainly, as you say, from the sentiment tracker that we have out, the sponsorship profession also believes so. And I think that's because we've now had 2 years without human contact. Now, sitting here hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and I very much hope in the future I can come and stand on your stage and enjoy the beauty of Greece, but it's not the same. It is just not the same. And I think we're seeing brands realize that whilst you can cut the money in the short term, it does have an impact. Because as I talked about in my presentation, branding is all about building those deep, meaningful relationships. And the best relationships are made when you're face to face, hand to hand, and you can interact and you can engage. And I think as companies get a little bit more comfortable again post-pandemic, they will start investing once again in these types of activities, because this is how we engage fans, this is how we change their minds, and that ultimately is how brands make more money.
Absolutely, and I hope we can welcome you in Greece when the circumstances allow for this. I have another question. How important is it for a team with a new stadium, the selection of the sponsor, of the name of the stadium? We have observed that this sponsorship lasts more than 5 to 10 years. What's your take on this?
Stadium sponsorship can offer enormous value to a sponsor and to the stadium. And I would caution about making it about badging, like just having a name on a stadium and leaving it at that. The question is, why does this brand want to sponsor the stadium? What is the problem that they're trying to fix? How is having their name on a stadium going to solve that problem? And if when you're looking for brands to sponsor, you can think about what is the solution that naming a stadium presents to a customer. How is this going to make a difference? If you start with that as your question and then work backwards as to all the different ways that it can help, and then ask yourself which brands are struggling with these problems, then you can build a really tight relationship with a partner. So that's why some partnerships last for years, because they are just an instinctive connection which is solving a problem. The ones that don't last are the ones that where they go, oh yes, we'll sponsor that. That looks nice. And then 2 years later, the leadership team have changed and they look at it and go, why are we sponsoring this? That's a waste of money. It's not helping us. Kill it. So think about, how is it going to really strategically make a difference? How is it going to change the world? I'll give you one example before I finish, and that would be the O2. So the O2 is the former Millennium Dome in London. It's sponsored by, named the O2, and it's possibly the biggest event space in the UK. And you might go, why is a mobile phone company, which is what O2 is, sponsoring an events company? So on the surface, there's no connection whatsoever. However, much like the Marriott example I gave earlier, O2 run priority moments. They reward their customers with unique and special entertainment type opportunities. So sponsoring a massive venue in central London that can be their absolute figurehead venue for this program makes absolute sense. And now they're so firmly embedded with this venue that it's really hard to imagine any other brand ever wanting to name the Millennium Dome. Now the O2 have one.
Thank you so much. We have another question that is relevant to technology. The audience is thanking you for the insightful presentation. Would you like to describe the relationship between big data analytics, artificial intelligence, and effective sponsorship in sport?
Goodness, that's a story that probably needs a PhD thesis to answer, which you probably are the person who's better positioned to answer than me. But let me answer this. I think, again, it comes back to the difference between an output and an outcome. A data lake with big data is brilliant. It will give you lots and lots of outputs. The question is, how do you take those outputs and then understand the difference it's making? So if your measure of success is someone to play a video on YouTube, well, that's great. But is that going to make someone buy? Is it going to change someone's mind? Is it going to change someone's opinion? If you can use big data and AI to say, when someone plays a video on YouTube and then goes to our website and then reads a bit more, then we can start to say, this is a person, we've delivered an outcome. We have changed someone's mind. We have driven them to get them to engage with our content. And I think that is probably the holy grail, is looking at using big data to look at individual groups of customers to really understand what actions they're taking, what are they doing as a result of it. If we look at each individual number in isolation, then we end up just getting overwhelmed with numbers that mean nothing.
That's a true story, and the veracity of big data is an issue as well. Mr. Leopold, I have one question that is related to the Greek context. We have sponsorship data in many European countries. How can we have such data for Greece? What do we need to do?
I think that firstly, there needs to be a demand for people to want to share it. And quite often, sponsorship data is not shared. So there is some data across Europe about the rights fees and about the investment and the work that's done. Generally, a lot of the data that we come across, certainly in the UK, is actually intelligent guesswork, because a lot of it is commercially sensitive. We would never reveal what our sponsorship deals were. We would never really reveal the full range of our assets or how much money we spend doing it. So I think be wary and be cautious about the data that you see shared, because there's always an agenda. Someone is revealing a piece of information because there's a reason that there's something they want to achieve. So I think in Greece, really it needs to start with one person or one organization wanting to take a lead, and ideally neutrally taking a lead. I think when someone is perhaps part of an agency or part of a specific brand, people may not be willing to be so open. But we're very lucky in the UK. We have a number of tracking organizations. We have a number of journalistic organizations who actually collate this information on behalf of everyone. And then it's trying to agree what sort of data is fair to share. So it may well be rights fees are not, but what else can we share? What is the progression? And ultimately, it's about the reason we collect the data is because everyone wants to make sponsorship better, and everyone wants to invest more to get more money and more better results for their companies and their organizations. So it may well need to start with the rights holders. Maybe it's a centralized academic research that needs to be done to pull it together. But I think it needs a will to share and an agreement as to what you will and what you can share. Of course, the simplest way is to do what we've done with ESSA and run an anonymous survey to start collating some of this information and creating an ongoing tracker to look at how are things changing, how much money are people spending, yet within brackets to identify where the market is going in your country.
Thank you so much. I have one last question, which is quite interesting. What about player sponsorship? Is it okay for them to have various sponsors in one season? Are there any specific rules? And finally, we have seen players advertising one brand and then using another one. What's your comment on that?
Yes, so sponsoring individuals, right, that there is a huge advantage to sponsoring an individual because, as I say, people buy from people, people want to engage with people. So if you have a person who endorses your product, that can be really, really powerful. That's why influencer marketing has shot up in Twitter and Instagram, because people like to buy from people. However, there is always the problem that people are not perfect. People make mistakes. We saw Chris Rock and Will Smith on the Oscar stage as a prime example as to some of the challenges. You cannot control reality. So my personal view is use them, but use them wisely and use them with caution. Be prepared if you're a big brand sponsoring a human being that you need to prepare for the worst case scenario. That means preparing what is the story if something were to happen. What happens if they were tragically to have an accident or an injury? How would we treat this? What would we do? What happens if they were to commit an act that would be morally unacceptable or legally unacceptable? What would we do? So my suggestion would be think ahead and prepare. And sadly, it means presuming the worst case scenario in everything rather than the best case. But it's the best case is always good. The worst case is what's going to keep you up at night and mean that you're going to answer very difficult telephone calls from your boss. So plan in advance, and hopefully you can minimize that particular risk. As for players with multiple sponsors, again, you can't blame them. Of course, if someone comes to you and says, I want you to advertise my product and pay you a lot of money, it's going to be very difficult for them to say no. You can put into contracts and you can insist they only use your product, but usually my experience is they want you to pay them a lot more to get them to do that, rather than just saying and endorsing your product. But that said, most of the people I've been involved with have been very understanding, and they accept that if they're going to take your money to promote a product, then they need to be genuine and authentic, and they actually need to use it, and they need to want to use it. And again, that would be my recommendation. Don't force your product on someone who doesn't really want to use it. You want an advocate. You want a champion. You want a fan. You want someone who can genuinely say to their audience, I use this and I like it because. And I think otherwise, you might want to find alternative ways of driving that authentic relationship.
It was great having you, Mr. Leopold. Thank you very much.
Thank you.